The snow falls over Paris on Christmas Eve with a patience that belongs to another century. Each flake descending through the amber glow of street lamps like a small, wandering thought looking for a place to rest. And you find yourself walking along the Seine just as the city begins its transformation into something softer, something that exists in the space between memory and dream, where the present moment stretches and yawns and becomes something wider than time itself. The bridges arc over the dark water with a grace that suggests they have always been there, that they grew up from the riverbed like stone trees, their reflections fragmenting in the gentle current, and the lights along the Quai de la Tournelle flicker in a rhythm that might be the heartbeat of the city itself, slow and steady and infinitely patient. The kind of rhythm that invites you to synchronize your own breathing to its ancient cadence, to let your footsteps fall in time with something larger than yourself. You are not hurrying because there is nowhere you need to be except here, in this moment that unfolds like a letter written in a language you are only beginning to remember. And the cold air carries with it the scent of roasting chestnuts from a vendor whose cart glows like a small hearth in the gathering dusk, the smoke rising in pale spirals that dissipate into the violet sky, and somewhere in the distance, church bells begin to ring, their sound rolling across the rooftops like waves across an ocean of slate and copper and ancient timber. The bells are everywhere and nowhere, their tones layering over one another in harmonies that seem to emerge from the stones themselves, from the very bones of the city. And you pause on the Pont Saint-Michel to listen, your hands resting on the cold stone balustrade, and the sound washes over you in waves that you can feel in your chest, in the hollow spaces behind your ribs, as if the bells are ringing inside you as much as they are ringing in the towers that punctuate the skyline with their dark silhouettes against the deepening blue of evening. There are dozens of churches in this part of Paris, perhaps hundreds, their spires rising above the mansard roofs like fingers pointing toward questions rather than answers. And at this hour on Christmas Eve, they all ring together in a chorus that has been repeated every year for centuries. A tradition so old that no one can quite remember when it began. Only that it has always been this way. The bells marking the passage of time and the arrival of something sacred, something that transforms the ordinary world into a space where miracles might quietly occur. But there is one set of bells that sounds different from all the others. A sequence of notes that doesn't quite match the harmonies you know. A melody that seems to come from somewhere deeper, somewhere older. And as you listen more carefully, trying to isolate these particular tones from all the others that fill the air, you realize that they are coming from the Ile de la Cité, from the oldest part of the city, from the heart of Paris, where the medieval walls once stood, and where the stones remember things that have been forgotten by the living. The sound is not louder than the other bells, but somehow it is more present, more insistent, as if these particular tones are searching for you specifically, as if they have been waiting through all the centuries for this exact moment when you would be standing on this bridge in the falling snow, listening, and something in your chest responds to them. Some tuning fork deep in your being that vibrates in sympathy with frequencies that seem to bypass your ears entirely and speak directly to some older part of your awareness. The part that understands music not as sound, but as a form of architecture, as a way of building spaces inside consciousness itself. You begin walking again, following the sound across the bridge and onto the island, past the flower market shuttered for the evening, past the Préfecture de Police with its windows glowing gold against the gray stone, past the small triangular park where the trees stand bare and patient in the snow, and the bells grow clearer with each step, their melody weaving through the narrow streets like a thread of gold through dark fabric, pulling you forward not with urgency but with a gentle, insistent invitation, the kind that makes you feel as if you have been walking toward this destination all your life without quite knowing it. The streets of the Ile de la Cité are narrow here, almost medieval in their proportions, the buildings leaning inward as if sharing secrets, their windows reflecting the street lamps in fragments of amber light. And the snow has begun to accumulate on the cobblestones in a thin, luminous layer that seems to glow with its own soft radiance, as if the ground itself is becoming translucent, as if you are walking on something less solid than you might imagine, on a surface that exists somewhere between earth and cloud, between stone and dream. And then you turn a corner, and there it is, Sainte-Chapelle, rising before you like a reliquary of light and stone, its walls so dense with stained glass that it seems more window than wall, more color than structure. And the snow falling around it creates a veil through which you see the building not quite clearly, but softly, gently, as if you are viewing it through multiple layers of silk, each one adding another degree of mystery, another level of remove from the ordinary world you inhabited just minutes ago. Though minutes might mean something different here, might stretch and contract like breath, like the spaces between heartbeats. The bells are definitely coming from here, from this chapel that was built in the 13th century to house what were believed to be fragments of the true cross and the crown of thorns, built by Louis IX in a style that reaches upward with such longing, such architectural yearning, that the building itself seems to be a prayer made solid, a devotion expressed in limestone and iron and glass that transforms light into color, into patches of ruby and sapphire and emerald that fall across the stone floors in pools of illumination that shift and change as the day progresses, that paint the world inside these walls with a palette borrowed from heaven, or from the imagination of heaven, or from whatever heaven becomes when filtered through the human desire to touch something infinite, something that extends beyond the boundaries of a single life. But the bells, you realize as you stand in the small courtyard before the chapel are not ringing in the bell tower, because Sainte-Chapelle has no bell tower, has never had a bell tower, has stood for more than 700 years as a chapel rather than a church, a place of private royal devotion rather than public worship. And yet the sound is unmistakable, is definitely coming from within these walls that enclose a space that might be larger on the inside than the outside, that might contain dimensions that are not quite architectural, not quite physical, but something else, something that exists in the realm of acoustics and light, in the spaces where physics and metaphysics overlap and become indistinguishable from one another. There is, of course, a reasonable explanation for everything, a way of understanding that keeps the world solid and predictable, and safely bounded by the known laws of cause and effect. And in this case, the explanation is simple enough. What you are hearing is not coming from Sainte-Chapelle at all, but rather from the nearby Cathedral of Notre Dame, whose bells are famous throughout Paris, whose Emmanuel bell in the South Tower has rung the hours since 1686 and whose voice carries across the entire island with a clarity and power that can sometimes create acoustic illusions, can sometimes seem to come from directions and distances that do not quite correspond to the actual location of the source. Because sound is a strange thing, is a wave that travels through air and stone and water with different speeds and different qualities, that bends around corners and reflects off surfaces, and creates phantom echoes in unexpected places. Or perhaps what you are hearing is the bells of Sainte-Chapelle's neighbor, the Conciergerie, the medieval palace that once served as a prison and that stands just beside the chapel, sharing walls and courtyards, and a history that is so interwoven that it becomes difficult to say where one building ends and the other begins. And there might be bells there, might be some small carillon or recording or electronic chime that marks the hours and that sounds in the muffled acoustic landscape of falling snow, as if it is coming from somewhere else entirely, from somewhere older, from somewhere that exists slightly to the left of the world you know. These are the explanations that the rational mind offers, the comfortable stories that allow you to categorize the experience and file it away under interesting acoustics or snow-induced auditory illusions. And you could accept these explanations and turn around and walk back across the bridge to the warm cafe you passed earlier. Could sit with a hot chocolate and watch the snow through steamed windows, and remember this as a pleasant moment, a small mystery encountered and dismissed, the kind of thing that adds texture to an evening but requires no further investigation, no deeper engagement with the questions it raises. But there is something in the quality of the bells that resists these simple explanations. Something in the way the notes seem to hang in the air longer than physics should allow, longer than any bell tone should sustain, as if the sound is not ending, but simply fading into another dimension, withdrawing gradually from this frequency range and continuing somewhere else, somewhere just beyond the reach of ordinary hearing. And you find yourself moving closer to the chapel, drawn by a curiosity that is not urgent but persistent. The kind of curiosity that feels less like a choice and more like a recognition, as if some part of you already knows what you will find, but needs to walk through the steps of discovery anyway. Needs to experience the unfolding revelation rather than simply accepting the conclusion. The courtyard is empty, has been empty perhaps for hours, because Sainte-Chapelle closes to tourists in the late afternoon, and on Christmas Eve there would be no reason for anyone to be here. No services held in this space that is technically a chapel but functionally a museum, a monument to medieval devotion that is visited and admired but no longer used for the purpose it was built to serve, no longer filled with the voices of monks in prayer or the footsteps of kings in meditation, but instead traversed by crowds of tourists who move through quickly, taking photographs of the stained glass and reading the placards that explain the history in 3 languages, and then moving on to the next destination on their carefully planned itineraries. But the building is there, rising before you in the snow, and the bells are still ringing, their melody now so clear and distinct that you can hear individual notes, can count the pattern of their sequence. 5 bells, you think, or perhaps 6, their tones arranged in a descending pattern that repeats and varies and repeats again. Never quite the same, but always recognizably the same melody. The kind of pattern that suggests not a random ringing, but a specific composition. A piece of music being played with intention and precision, with the care of a performance rather than the mechanical regularity of automated chimes. You approach the iron fence that surrounds the chapel, your fingers finding the cold metal bars, and you peer through into the shadows of the porch, and there is no one there. No sign of any person who might be ringing bells or playing a recording. Only the silence of the empty courtyard and the soft accumulation of snow on the steps and the lingering presence of the bells that continue to sound from somewhere that cannot quite be pinpointed, from somewhere that seems to move as you move, staying always at the same apparent distance, always just beyond the threshold of exact location. The acoustics of this courtyard are strange. You notice now that you are paying attention, are shaped by the way the surrounding buildings funnel sound, by the hard surfaces of stone that reflect and amplify and distort, and it would be easy to imagine that you are experiencing some trick of architecture, some accidental arrangement of walls and angles that catches sound from the nearby cathedral and redirects it, transforms it, makes it seem to come from this particular building, when in fact it is coming from somewhere else entirely, from somewhere mundane and explainable. But the snow is falling more heavily now, accumulating on your shoulders and hair, and the snow should muffle sound, should absorb the bells and soften them, should make them quieter rather than clearer, and yet with each passing moment they seem to grow more distinct, more present, more impossible to dismiss as a trick of distance or weather, and you find yourself pressing closer to the fence, your face between the bars, trying to see into the upper windows of the chapel where the stained glass glows faintly with some interior illumination, some light that must be coming from the street lamps outside, but that seems somehow to be emanating from within the glass itself, from the ruby reds and cobalt blues and emerald greens that were created by medieval artisans who ground minerals and metals into powders and mixed them with molten glass and created colors that have lasted for 7 centuries. Colors that seem more alive than any paint could be, that seem to contain their own luminosity, their own inner fire. And as you watch, as you stand in the falling snow with the bells ringing in your ears and in your chest and in the spaces behind your thoughts, you notice something that makes you forget about cold and snow and the rational explanations you were constructing. Something so subtle that you might have missed it if you had not been paying such close attention. If you had not been in this particular state of receptive awareness, where small details become significant, where the peripheral vision of consciousness becomes more acute than its direct focus. The light inside Sainte-Chapelle is moving, is not fixed but flowing, is changing in a rhythm that matches the bells, each note accompanied by a subtle shift in the colors visible through the windows, as if the sound and the light are connected, as if they are two aspects of the same phenomenon, two ways of expressing something that exists prior to both sound and light, something more fundamental. And the movement creates patterns that your eyes try to follow but cannot quite capture. Patterns that suggest shapes and forms but never quite resolve into anything definite, into anything that could be photographed or described or proven to exist beyond your own private perception. You step back from the fence, your breath visible in the cold air, small clouds that dissipate quickly, and you realize that you have been standing here longer than you intended, that time has passed in a way that felt compressed, that felt like moments but might have been much longer, and the snow has accumulated on the ground around you, has covered your footprints, has created the impression that you have been standing in this spot forever, that you are as permanent and stationary as the buildings themselves, as if you might be slowly transforming into stone, into one more element of this medieval landscape where past and present exist in layers, each one visible through the others if you know how to adjust your vision, if you know how to see the way the bells are teaching you to see. The streets are quiet, unusually quiet for Paris even on Christmas Eve, as if the snow has created a buffer between you and the ordinary world, as if you have passed through some invisible membrane into a space that is adjacent to the city but not quite part of it. A pocket dimension that overlaps with Paris but operates according to slightly different rules, where the usual bustle and noise have been replaced by a silence that feels not empty but full, pregnant with possibilities, with things that are about to happen or are currently happening in ways too subtle for normal awareness to detect. You pass the southern wall of the complex, where the ancient stones show their age in the irregular coursing of the masonry, in the way different eras of construction overlap and intersect. Medieval work butting against later renovations, each period leaving its own signature in the choice of stone and the style of carving, and the snow catches in the crevices between stones, outlining each block in white, making the structure look like a drawing, like something sketched in charcoal and chalk on gray paper, and the bells continue their pattern, their 5-note or 6-note sequence that repeats with variations, that seems to be telling a story or asking a question, or perhaps doing both simultaneously. The way music can mean multiple things at once, can be both question and answer, both story and response to story. There is a small door, barely noticeable, set into the wall of what must be the conciergerie, and as you approach it you see that it is slightly ajar, impossibly ajar because these buildings are supposed to be secured and locked, are supposed to be closed to the public, are supposed to be as sealed and protected as any museum or historical monument. But here is this door, this ordinary wooden door reinforced with iron bands, and it is open by perhaps an inch, perhaps 2 inches, just enough to create a dark vertical line in the gray stone, just enough to suggest passage from outside to inside, from the known world to whatever lies beyond this threshold. You pause at the door, your hand hovering over the cold wood, and the rational part of your mind raises all the appropriate objections. This is trespassing. This is illegal. This is probably dangerous, probably foolish, probably something that will end badly. But the bells are still ringing, and they seem to be coming from just beyond this door, seem to be inviting you specifically to enter. And there is something in the quality of the moment that makes ordinary concerns seem irrelevant, seem like they belong to a different context entirely, to a world of rules and regulations and appropriate behavior that exists somewhere else, that has no jurisdiction here in this snow-quiet space where mystery takes precedence over caution. You push the door gently, and it swings open on hinges that make no sound, that move with a smoothness that suggests frequent use, or perhaps careful maintenance, or perhaps simply the fluid logic of dreams, where doors open because they are meant to open, because the narrative requires them to open, because you are meant to pass through them, and you step inside and pull the door closed behind you, not latching it, but leaving it as you found it, slightly ajar, maintaining the possibility of retreat, of return to the ordinary world, if this should prove to be a mistake, if the bells should turn out to be nothing more than your own loneliness given voice, your own yearning for something inexplicable, made temporarily audible through some work of acoustics and attention. Inside, you find yourself in a stone corridor, narrow and dark, lit only by what little light filters through small windows set high in the wall. And the air smells of old stone and older silence, of centuries of stillness broken only occasionally by footsteps that leave no lasting mark, by voices that echo briefly and then fade into the absorptive darkness. And the corridor extends ahead of you and behind you, curving slightly so that you cannot see either end, creating the impression that you are inside something circular, something that might not have ends at all but only continuous beginning, only the same space repeating itself with subtle variations, like a melody that transforms as it progresses, that never quite returns to its starting point but always remains recognizably itself. The bells are clearer here, much clearer, no longer muffled by walls and weather, but direct and present. And you can hear now that they are not bells in the ordinary sense, not bronze bells struck by clappers, but something else, something that produces bell-like tones, but with a quality that is somehow more crystalline, more pure, as if the sound is being generated by striking glass rather than metal, by causing some transparent substance to vibrate and sing. And the tones have an almost tactile quality, as if you could reach out and touch them, as if they are solid objects floating in the air rather than compression waves traveling through an invisible medium. You move forward through the corridor, one hand trailing along the stone wall for guidance, for reassurance, for the confirmation that solid matter still exists, that you have not completely dissolved into sensation and sound, and the stone is cold under your fingers, is real and present and ancient, worn smooth in places by centuries of hands that have done exactly what you are doing now, that have followed this same path for reasons that might have been similar to yours, or might have been entirely different, might have been escaping, or seeking, or simply lost and trying to find a way back to familiar territory. The corridor opens into a larger space, a room that might be circular or might be octagonal, difficult to tell in the dim light that comes from sources you cannot identify, that seems to emanate from the stones themselves or from the air between the stones, a phosphorescence that is barely sufficient for sight, but that creates an atmosphere of deep twilight, of the hour between sunset and night when the world exists in shades of blue and gray and purple, when objects lose their distinct edges and blend into one another, when the boundary between seeing and imagining becomes permeable, becomes something you can pass through without quite noticing the transition. And here, in this space that might be a room or might be the interior of a tower, you see them. Not bells, not exactly, but something that serves the function of bells, something that occupies the conceptual space where bells should be. Objects that hang suspended in the air by no visible means, by no chains or ropes or mechanical suspension, just hanging there, as if the air itself has become solid enough to support them, as if gravity has been negotiated with and has agreed to make an exception in this particular case, in this particular space where the usual rules are observed more lightly, with more flexibility, with an understanding that rules are guidelines rather than absolutes, are descriptions of what usually happens rather than prescriptions of what must always happen. The objects are not made of metal, you realize as you move closer, drawn by fascination that has completely replaced caution, that has made you forget that you are trespassing, that you are in a place you have no permission to be. They are made of glass, of crystal perhaps, of some transparent material that catches what little light exists and transforms it, amplifies it, sends it out in pale beams that intersect and create patterns in the air, geometric shapes that appear and disappear, that seem to have meaning without quite being readable, that seem to be a language just beyond your ability to comprehend. A script written in light rather than ink, in angles rather than letters. There are 6 of them, you can count them now, 6 crystalline forms hanging in a circle, each one a different size, each one a different shape, one like a teardrop, one like an elongated diamond, one like a spiral that seems to twist through more than 3 dimensions, one like a star with too many points, one like a sphere, but somehow also not quite spherical, as if it is a sphere observed from an angle that should not be possible, and one that you cannot quite look at directly, that seems to shift whenever your eyes try to focus on it, that exists more as an absence than a presence, more as a space where light goes but doesn't return than as an object in any conventional sense. And they are ringing. These things that are not quite bells are producing the sounds you have been following, are vibrating in response to some force you cannot see, some energy that might be sound itself, or might be something that becomes sound when it intersects with this particular configuration of crystal and space and ancient stone. And the tones they produce are not just sounds but experiences, are things that happen to your entire body rather than just your ears, that resonate in your bones and blood and cells, that make you feel as if you are being played, as if you have become an instrument yourself, as if the boundary between listener and music has dissolved and you are both at once, both the ear that receives and the bell that gives, both the question and the answer, both the search and the finding. You stand in the center of the circle, turning slowly to look at each of the 6 crystalline forms in turn. And as you do, you notice that the room itself is responding to the bells, is resonating in sympathy, the stones themselves beginning to emit a faint glow that pulses in time with the tones, that creates the impression that the walls are breathing, that the building has a heartbeat, and you are standing inside it, inside something living, inside something that is aware of your presence and is perhaps aware in a more general sense, is conscious in the way that very old things might be conscious, not with thoughts or intentions, but with a kind of patient attention, a witnessing that requires no action, that simply observes and remembers and continues, that has watched the centuries pass and will watch more centuries pass and will remain here, ringing its crystalline bells, creating patterns in light and sound, and possibly in other dimensions that human senses cannot directly perceive but can perhaps feel, can perhaps recognize in the way that sleeping animals recognize the approach of dawn, in the way that migrating birds recognize directions that have no names. There would be, you think, trying to engage the analytical part of your mind, trying to ground this experience in something resembling reason, a scientific explanation for what you are seeing, something involving resonant frequencies and piezoelectric effects, something about crystal structures and their ability to convert mechanical stress into electrical fields, and vice versa. Something about the unique acoustic properties of this particular space, this chamber that might have been designed, intentionally or accidentally, to amplify certain frequencies, to create standing waves, to trap sound in patterns that reinforce and build upon themselves until the air itself becomes thick with vibration, until you can feel the sound as a physical pressure against your skin, against your face, against the front of your body where you are most open to the world. Quartz crystal, you remember from somewhere, from some half-forgotten science lesson or documentary or book, can oscillate at precise frequencies when subjected to an electric field, and this property is used in clocks and radio transmitters and all manner of electronic devices that require stable timing, that require absolute regularity. And perhaps these crystalline bells are some early experiment in this direction, some medieval or Renaissance investigation into the properties of crystal, some attempt by scholars or alchemists or natural philosophers to harness the strange behaviors of mineral structures, to create timepieces or musical instruments, or possibly something else, something that had purposes we can no longer quite understand, because the framework for understanding them has been lost, has been replaced by newer paradigms that answer different questions and ignore the ones that seemed urgent to earlier generations. But this explanation, even as you construct it, even as you try to believe it, feels inadequate, feels like it is describing something adjacent to what you are experiencing, but not the thing itself, the way that describing the chemical composition of paint does not account for the effect of a painting, does not explain why certain arrangements of pigment can move people to tears or joy or contemplation, does not bridge the gap between physical substance and aesthetic experience, between matter and meaning. The bells continue their sequence, their pattern that repeats and varies, and you realize now that the variations are not random but structured, are following some kind of progression, are moving through a series that might be mathematical or musical or both. Because mathematics and music were once understood to be aspects of the same thing, were both part of the quadrivium, were both ways of understanding the fundamental harmonies of the universe, the ratios and proportions that govern everything from the orbits of planets to the intervals between musical notes, that create the sense that existence itself is ordered, is patterned, is not chaos but cosmos, not randomness, but a design so vast and complex that it appears random only because we cannot perceive the scale on which the pattern repeats, cannot see the full structure because we are inside it, are part of it, are notes in a composition that is still being played, that has no ending because it has no beginning, because it simply is, simply exists in an eternal present that we experience as time only because we are moving through it, only because our consciousness travels in one direction and cannot see the whole at once. You notice now that the floor of this chamber is not simply stone, but is inlaid with patterns, with lines of different colored marble, or perhaps metal, that catch the faint light and create geometric designs, circles within circles, hexagons, stars, forms that echo the shapes of the crystalline bells above. And the patterns seem to be more than decorative, seem to have some function, some purpose, and you find yourself following one of the lines with your eyes, tracing its path as it curves and branches and rejoins itself, creating loops and spirals that make you think of the labyrinth at Chartres, of the sacred geometry that medieval architects embedded in their buildings, believing that certain proportions and shapes could facilitate prayer, could help consciousness ascend toward the divine, could create physical spaces that corresponded to spiritual states, that made the invisible visible, the transcendent immanent, the eternal temporally present. The light is growing stronger, you notice, or perhaps your eyes are adapting to the dimness, learning to see in this twilight environment, learning to perceive frequencies of light that normally go unnoticed, and the walls are becoming more visible, are revealing details that were hidden in shadow. And you see now that they are covered in inscriptions, in text carved into the stone in letters so small and so numerous that they create what appears at first to be texture rather than writing, a pattern that only resolves into words when you move very close, when you bend down or reach up, when you let your eyes lose focus slightly and allow the shapes to organize themselves, to coalesce from visual noise into meaning. The inscriptions are in Latin mostly, with some French and what might be Hebrew or Arabic or some other script you cannot read. And the Latin is medieval, is spelled in ways that make it difficult to parse. But you can make out words here and there, can catch fragments. Sonus perpetuus, eternal sound. Lux crystallina, crystalline light. Tempus non est. Time is not, or perhaps more accurately, there is no time. time does not exist, and other phrases that seem to be describing what you are experiencing seem to be instructions or observations left by whoever created this place, whoever installed these crystalline bells and understood their properties, who knew what would happen when they were struck or activated, or simply allowed to hang in this particular configuration of space and stone and silence. You run your hand along the wall, your fingers tracing the carved letters, and the stone is not cold anymore. Or perhaps your hand has adjusted to its temperature, has equalized with it, and there is a moment when you cannot tell where your hand ends and the stone begins, when the boundary between your body and the building becomes uncertain, becomes negotiable, and you wonder if this is part of what the bells do, if they somehow dissolve the usual sense of separation, if they create conditions in which consciousness can extend beyond its ordinary boundaries, can flow into the world and discover that the world is not external after all, that subject and object are distinctions that exist only at certain scales, that at other scales everything is continuous, everything is connected, everything is part of a single vast pattern that is simultaneously material and mental, simultaneously wave and particle, simultaneously here and everywhere, simultaneously now and always. The bells reach a crescendo, all 6 of them sounding together in a chord that is so complex you cannot quite hear all of it, that seems to contain more notes than 6 bells should be able to produce, harmonics and overtones layering upon each other, creating the impression of hundreds of bells, of a full carillon, of an orchestra made entirely of glass, and the sound fills the chamber completely, fills you completely, and for a moment you are nothing but sound, nothing but vibration, nothing but a particular pattern of waves propagating through space. And there is no fear in this dissolution, no anxiety about losing yourself, only a sense of relief, of release, of finally letting go of the effort of being separate, of being a distinct individual with boundaries and defenses. And you understand in this moment, not intellectually but experientially, that the bells are not making music, but are revealing music that already exists, are making audible the constant vibration of existence itself, the hum of atoms, the resonance of fundamental fields, the song that everything sings simply by virtue of existing, by virtue of being patterns in space-time rather than void, by virtue of being something rather than nothing. You don't know how long you sit there, your back against the inscribed wall, your eyes half closed, watching the crystalline bells sway slightly in air currents you cannot feel, or perhaps not swaying at all but giving the impression of movement through the way light refracts through them, through the way they seem to breathe, to pulse, to live in a way that has nothing to do with biological life, but that nonetheless deserves the name, deserves to be called living because it responds, because it changes, because it is part of a system that exchanges energy with its environment, that takes something in and gives something back, that participates in the great cycling of forces that keeps stars burning and planets turning and thoughts arising in the neural networks of brains that are themselves made of star stuff, of atoms that were forged in the cores of suns that died billions of years ago, that scattered their substance into space, where it eventually coalesced into new suns and new planets, and eventually into the complex molecules that could replicate themselves, that could evolve, that could develop into nervous systems complex enough to wonder about crystalline bells in medieval chapels, to ask questions about the nature of sound and light and consciousness, to sit in ancient rooms and feel time becoming elastic, becoming something other than the simple forward flow that ordinary experience suggests, becoming something more like a geography, a landscape that you can move through in multiple directions, that contains all moments simultaneously, past and future, and present existing together like different rooms in a vast mansion, like different chapters in a book that you can open to any page, that you can read in any order, because the story is not really linear anyway. It's not really about one thing leading to another, but about patterns that resonate across time, that echo back and forth between events separated by centuries, that create meaningful connections not through causation, but through similarity, through correspondence, through the kind of sympathetic resonance that makes one bell ring when another bell nearby is struck, makes one mind think thoughts that another mind thought 1,000 years ago, makes you feel, sitting here in this stone chamber on Christmas Eve, a kinship with people you will never meet, people who lived and died before you were born, who nevertheless were trying to understand the same mysteries you are trying to understand. Who built this place or used this place or discovered this place and left these inscriptions as a way of saying, "We were here, we heard the bells, we felt what you are feeling, and we wanted you to know that you are not alone, that the journey you are on has been taken before, that there is a tradition of this kind of seeking, a lineage of people who have wanted to know what lies behind the surface of things, what animates matter, what it means to be conscious, to be aware, to be a particular point of view on the universe that is simultaneously inside the universe and somehow also observing it from outside, that is both participant and witness, both the dancer and the dance. The history of this place, you think, trying to anchor yourself back in something like normal thinking, must be extraordinary, must be documented somewhere in archives and scholarly journals, must have been the subject of research and debate, because a chamber like this with these crystalline bells and these inscriptions and this extraordinary acoustic cannot have escaped notice, cannot have remained secret. And yet you have never heard of it, have never read about it in any guidebook or history of Paris, have never seen it mentioned in any of the countless books and articles about Sainte-Chapelle, about the Ile de la Cité, about the medieval architecture of the city. And this absence of documentation is itself strange. is itself part of the mystery, suggests either that the chamber is not as old as it seems, is some modern installation that you are misinterpreting, or that it has been deliberately hidden, deliberately excluded from the historical record, kept secret by some organization or group that understands its significance and wants to preserve it, wants to protect it from the kind of attention that would inevitably destroy it, that would turn it into a tourist attraction, a curiosity, a place that people would visit in order to take photographs and check it off their lists, not in order to sit quietly and listen, not in order to let the bells work their strange magic, their transformation of consciousness that is so subtle and so profound that most people would probably not even notice it, would experience only a vague sense of peace or strangeness and then move on, return to their ordinary concerns, carry with them only a faint echo of something they brushed up against but did not quite perceive. Or perhaps, you think, allowing yourself to follow a more speculative line of thought. Perhaps the chamber exists in some kind of liminal space, some crack in the architecture of reality, where things that shouldn't be possible become briefly, occasionally accessible, where the usual rules are suspended, and other rules, older rules, rules that governed the universe before human consciousness emerged to observe and categorize and explain, become temporarily operational. And perhaps what you are experiencing is not exactly happening in the normal world at all, but in some adjacent dimension, some parallel space that overlaps with Paris but is not quite Paris, that shares the same coordinates but exists in a different frequency, a different bandwidth of reality, and the crystalline bells are somehow tuned to this frequency, are vibrating at a rate that opens a doorway, that creates a threshold between worlds, between states of being, between different modes of existence, and you have passed through this doorway without quite realizing it, have stepped from one kind of reality into another, and are only now beginning to understand that the rules you have been assuming, the laws of physics and causation and time that you have taken for granted your entire life, might not apply here, might be local rather than universal, might be habits of matter rather than absolute constraints. The thought should be frightening, should trigger all the survival instincts that are designed to keep you anchored in consensus reality, in the shared world where cause and effect operate predictably and where your actions have comprehensible consequences. But instead, you find it liberating, find it exciting in a quiet way, in the way that expansion is exciting, the way that growing is exciting, the way that any movement beyond the known into the unknown carries with it a quality of exhilaration, even when it also carries uncertainty, carries risk, carries the possibility that you might not find your way back, might not be able to return to the person you were before you entered this chamber, before you heard these bells, before you allowed yourself to dissolve into sound and light, and the timeless present that seems to be the natural state of this place, the default mode that reasserts itself as soon as you stop insisting on being someone separate, someone distinct, someone with a name and a history and a future, all of which are stories you tell yourself, narratives that create coherence and continuity, but that might not be as solid as they seem, might be more like the snowflakes falling outside, unique and intricate and beautiful, but also temporary, also destined to melt, to merge back into the water from which they crystallized, to lose their distinctive form and return to formlessness, to the potential from which all forms emerge. Christmas, you remember suddenly, is about incarnation, about spirit taking material form, about the infinite expressing itself in the finite, about transcendence becoming immanent. And perhaps that is why these bells are ringing tonight, why they can be heard tonight, why the door was open and the chamber was accessible. Because there are times when the boundary between worlds becomes thin, becomes permeable, becomes something you can pass through. And Christmas Eve is one of those times, has always been one of those times, is a moment when the year is dying and about to be reborn, when darkness reaches its maximum extent and begins to retreat, when the sun stands still in its apparent journey across the sky and then turns back toward summer, toward light, toward the return of growth and warmth and the green world. And this astronomical turning point has been marked by humans for thousands of years, has been celebrated long before Christianity claimed the date for its own purposes, has been recognized as a threshold, a doorway, a time when magic is possible, when the impossible becomes briefly, gloriously real. There is, you notice now, that the bells have drawn your attention inward, drawn your focus away from the walls and the inscriptions and the crystalline forms themselves. There is a doorway in the chamber, a small archway that you didn't see before, or that wasn't there before, or that has always been there, but visible only under certain conditions, only when you are in a particular state of receptivity, of openness. And the archway is dark, is filled with darkness that seems more substantial than ordinary shadow, that seems to have weight and texture, that seems to be less the absence of light and more a presence in its own right, a thing rather than the lack of a thing, and you find yourself standing without having decided to stand. Find yourself moving toward the archway without having chosen to move, pulled by a curiosity that has moved beyond anything you would call interest or even fascination, and has become something more like necessity, like the gravity that pulls water downhill, like the magnetism that aligns iron filings, like any of the fundamental forces that operate on matter not through choice, but through the inherent properties of the matter itself, through what it is rather than what it decides. The archway is narrow, is barely wide enough for your shoulders, and you have to turn slightly sideways to pass through it, have to brush against the stone on both sides, and the stone is warm now, is distinctly warm, as if there is a fire on the other side, or as if the stone itself is generating heat, is metabolizing something, is alive in a way that stone is not supposed to be alive. And as you pass through the archway, you feel a tingling sensation across your entire body, a mild electric current. Or perhaps just the sensitivity of skin responding to some change in the air, some change in pressure or humidity or temperature, or possibly some change in something that has no name in physics, some quality of space itself that varies from place to place, that makes some locations feel heavy and some feel light, makes some rooms feel welcoming and some feel hostile, makes some buildings feel sacred and some feel profane. An X factor that architects and builders have always known about, even though they cannot measure it, cannot quantify it, can only recognize it through intuition, through the sense that certain proportions and materials and orientations create a feeling, create an atmosphere, create conditions in which something that is usually confined can expand, can breathe, can become more than it normally is. Beyond the archway, you find yourself in a smaller chamber, much smaller, intimate almost, barely large enough for 3 or 4 people to stand comfortably, and the shape is unusual, is not circular or rectangular, but somewhere in between, is organic somehow, as if the space has been carved to follow the natural formations in the rock rather than imposed upon it, as if whoever created this place was working with the stone rather than against it, was revealing something that was already there, rather than creating something new. And the walls here are smooth, are polished to a high gloss that reflects a little light that penetrates from the outer chamber, that creates the impression of water, of standing inside a bubble beneath the surface of a dark lake. And the acoustics are different here, are so dead, so completely absorptive that sound seems to stop immediately, seems to die the moment it leaves your mouth, so that even the sound of your breathing is muted, is private, is contained within your own head rather than existing in shared space. And in the center of this inner chamber, resting on what might be a natural formation of rock, or might be a pedestal carved to look natural, there is a single crystal, larger than the bells in the outer chamber, perhaps the size of your torso, irregular in shape but clearly not natural, clearly worked, clearly shaped by intention and craft and care. And it is glowing, is definitely glowing with its own internal light, not brightly but steadily, with a soft blue-white radiance that might be phosphorescence or might be something else, might be some property of the crystal itself, some stored energy being released in the form of light, in the form of illumination, both literal and metaphorical, because to illuminate means both to light up and to understand, to make clear, to reveal what was hidden, what was dark. You approach the crystal slowly, respectfully, with the sense that you are approaching something sacred, something that demands reverence not because any authority has declared it sacred, but because sacredness is simply what it is its inherent quality. The way that fire is hot and ice is cold, and certain places and objects and moments are sacred, are charged with significance, are openings onto something larger, and you can feel the pull of it. The magnetic or gravitational or spiritual attraction that makes you want to reach out, to touch, to connect, and you extend your hand slowly, giving yourself time to reconsider, time to pull back if fear or caution should assert itself. But they don't, and your fingertips make contact with the cool, smooth surface of the crystal, and the world changes. Not dramatically, not with a flash of light or a crash of thunder, or any of the dramatic effects that stories use to mark transformation, but quietly, gently, the way dawn changes night, the way spring changes winter, with a gradual shift that is only obvious in retrospect, that is happening too slowly to be perceived in the moment, but that accumulates, that builds, that crosses some threshold beyond which things are different, are new, are other than they were, and you realize that you are no longer entirely in your body, or rather, you are in your body, but you are also somehow outside it, are both the perspective looking out through your eyes and the perspective looking at yourself from a few feet away, from slightly above and to the left, seeing yourself standing in this stone chamber with your hand on a glowing crystal, seeing the scene as if you are directing a film, are setting up a shot, are choosing the angle and the framing and the lighting, except you are not choosing anything, are simply observing from this doubled perspective, this simultaneous inside and outside, this position that is both subjective and objective at once. And from this perspective, you can see things you couldn't see before, can see the way energy moves through the space, can see lines of force or flow or intention that connect everything to everything else, that make the chamber not a collection of separate objects, but a single unified system, a circuit through which something is flowing, and you are part of the circuit now, have become part of it by touching the crystal, have closed a loop that allows something to circulate that couldn't circulate before. And what is circulating is not electricity exactly. Though it has some of the properties of electricity, is not light exactly. Though it illuminates, is not consciousness exactly. Though it is aware, is something more fundamental than any of these things, is something that underlies all of them. That is the common source from which matter and energy and mind all emerge, the ground of being, the field that generates all particles, the canvas on which the universe is painted. You see, or you understand, or you remember. The verb is difficult to choose because the experience is unlike any normal mode of cognition, is not quite perception and not quite thought, but something that includes both and is more than both. you see, understand. Remember that the crystal is very old, is older than Sainte-Chapelle, older than Paris, older than France, older than Christianity, older perhaps than human civilization, is something that was found rather than made, was discovered in some cave or mine or secret place, and was recognized by whoever found it as being significant, as being powerful, as being something that should be preserved and protected and kept in a place where it could be used, where it could do its work, whatever that work might be. And its work, you understand now, is something like healing, something like tuning, something like bringing into alignment things that have drifted out of alignment. And the things that have drifted might be physical, bodies that are sick or injured or aging, but might also be less tangible. Relationships, communities, civilizations, the relationship between humans and nature, between consciousness and matter, between the temporal and the eternal, all of which can fall out of harmony, can become discordant, can generate suffering and confusion, and the sense that something is wrong, that something has been lost, that there was a time when people knew something that has been forgotten, when the world made sense in a way it no longer makes sense, when life had a meaning that it has somehow mislaid. Time in this inner chamber has become completely untethered from time outside, has become something local and private, something that flows at whatever rate feels appropriate to the experience you are having, and you might have been standing here with your hand on the crystal for seconds or hours or days. There is no way to know. No clock that could measure this kind of duration, this kind of depth. Because time here is not horizontal but vertical, is not extent but intensity, is not the time of clocks and calendars but the time of dreams and meditation, the time that expands when you are absorbed in something, when you are so completely present to what you are doing, that there is no part of you standing outside the experience measuring it, judging it, comparing it to other experiences. No part of you that is not simply here, now. In this stone chamber on what might still be Christmas Eve, or might be Christmas Day, or might be some other time altogether. Some time that exists outside the normal sequence. Some parenthesis in the narrative of ordinary life. Some aside. Some moment that the main plot pauses to accommodate, knowing that what happens here matters even though it doesn't advance the story, doesn't get you anywhere, doesn't accomplish anything in the usual sense, but accomplishes something more important, accomplishes a deepening, a widening and opening of the aperture through which you perceive reality, through which reality perceives itself through you. You remove your hand from the crystal slowly, reluctantly, and the doubled perspective collapses back into the normal single viewpoint, back into being just yourself, looking out through your own eyes. And there is a sense of loss in this, a sense of having glimpsed something vast and then having to return to something small, But there is also relief, because the vast perspective is not sustainable, is not something you can maintain while still performing the basic functions of biological existence, still eating and sleeping and navigating through the physical world, still interacting with other people who are operating from the ordinary perspective, and who would find your altered state not enlightening but disturbing, not transcendent but delusional, because consensus reality has boundaries, has rules about what is acceptable to perceive and what is not, has strong mechanisms for keeping everyone synchronized, for keeping everyone operating from approximately the same set of assumptions about what is real and what is not, what is possible and what is not, what is sane and what is crazy. But something has shifted, something has opened, and you know that you will not be able to completely forget this, will not be able to return entirely to the person you were before you entered this place, before you heard the bells, before you touched the crystal and experienced that moment of doubled consciousness, of seeing yourself from outside while simultaneously being yourself from inside. And this shift is permanent, is irreversible, is like learning to read or learning to swim or learning any skill that once acquired cannot be unacquired, that changes you in a way that persists, that becomes part of who you are, part of how you navigate the world, part of the toolkit you use to make sense of experience. The crystal continues its soft glow, continues its patient presence in the center of the chamber, and you understand that it has been here a long time and will be here a long time after you leave, that it is not dependent on you or on any individual human for its existence, that it predates human observation and will outlast it, that it is part of something larger, part of a pattern that includes human consciousness, but is not limited to human consciousness, that extends into realms we cannot directly access, but can perhaps infer, can perhaps sense at the edges of perception. The way you can sense that someone is looking at you even when you cannot see them. The way you can feel the presence of a mountain even in darkness. The way you can know that the ocean is nearby before you see it or hear it, just from the quality of the air, from the smell of salt and kelp, from something that registers not as information but as feeling, as atmosphere, as a shift in the texture of existence. You think about the people who have been here before, who have stood where you are standing, who have touched this crystal and experienced whatever transformation it offered them. And you wonder if they were monks or mystics or scholars or kings. Wonder if Louis IX himself might have come here, might have known about this place, might have built Sainte-Chapelle above it deliberately, might have designed the entire chapel as a kind of gateway, a threshold between the public religious space above and this private esoteric space below, between orthodoxy and mystery, between the religion of the masses and the religion of the adepts. between exoteric teaching that can be spoken aloud and esoteric knowledge that must be discovered personally, must be earned through seeking, through persistence, through willingness to follow strange bells through snow, quiet streets, and through doors that shouldn't be open into chambers that shouldn't exist. Or perhaps you think, perhaps this place has nothing to do with Christianity at all. Perhaps it was here before the chapel, before the Ile de la Cité was settled. Perhaps it was a sacred space for the Parisi, the Celtic tribe that gave the city its name. Perhaps they knew about the crystal and the bells and built their own structures here, their own temples or shrines or places of initiation, and perhaps those structures were destroyed, or buried, or incorporated into later buildings, the way churches are often built on the sites of pagan temples, the way sacred geography persists even as the religions change, even as the stories change. Because the sacredness is not in the story, but in the place itself, in the particular configuration of earth and stone and water that make some locations feel different, feel special, feel like thin places where the boundary between worlds is permeable, where it is easier to cross over, easier to receive visions, easier to communicate with whatever it is that exists on the other side of ordinary consciousness. Whatever it is that mystics and shamans and poets have been trying to describe for thousands of years using metaphors of light and love and union and dissolution and rebirth. You understand. As you stand once more in the outer chamber watching the crystalline bells in their slow dance, in their endless subtle rocking that might be caused by air currents, or might be self-generated, might be the bells themselves choosing to move, choosing to interact with each other through vibrations that propagate through the air and through the stone, and through the network of connections that binds everything to everything else in webs of influence too complex for any mind to fully map, too vast for any consciousness to completely comprehend. You understand that it is time to leave. Not because you want to leave, but because the experience is complete, is whole, has reached a natural conclusion, has said what it needed to say, and to stay longer would be to repeat rather than to deepen, would be to cling rather than to release. And one of the lessons the bells seem to be teaching is about letting go, about allowing things to arise and pass away, about not grasping at experiences, even beautiful ones, even transcendent ones, because the grasping is what creates suffering, the wanting to keep what cannot be kept, to preserve what is by nature impermanent, to hold in fixed form what is essentially fluid, essentially flowing, essentially part of a process that is larger than any moment, larger than any single experience, larger than any individual life. You move toward the doorway through which you entered, back into the stone corridor that will lead you eventually to the outside world, to the snow and the cold, and the city of Paris going about its Christmas Eve business. And as you walk, you notice that the corridor seems different now, seems lighter somehow, or perhaps you are different. Perhaps your eyes have changed, have learned to see in wavelengths they couldn't see before, have become sensitized to subtle variations in light and shadow that previously went unnoticed. And the inscriptions on the walls seem almost to glow, seem almost to be self-luminous. And you wonder if they were always this way, or if they are responding to you, responding to whatever change the crystal worked in you, whatever frequency you are now vibrating at that makes you visible to systems that previously could not see you, that makes you part of networks that previously had no node where you could connect. The cold air hits you as you step back through the door into the courtyard, and it is shocking, is bracing, is a reminder that you have a body, that bodies need to be kept warm, that physical existence has requirements and constraints and cannot be ignored indefinitely regardless of how interesting the inner realms might be. And you pull your coat closer around you and look up at the sky where the snow is still falling, is still descending in those patient spirals that seem to have no urgency, seem to be taking their time, seem to be enjoying the journey from cloud to ground. And you wonder if snowflakes are conscious in their own way, if they experience their brief existence as they fall through the cold air, if they feel joy or peace or simple being, or if consciousness requires complexity, requires nervous systems and neurons and all the biological machinery that humans possess, or if consciousness is more fundamental than that, is something that exists at all scales, in all systems, in everything that is, because if everything is made of the same fundamental stuff, if everything is ultimately energy vibrating at different frequencies, then why would consciousness be limited to only some configurations of that energy? Why would only biological systems be aware? Why wouldn't the universe itself be aware? Be experiencing itself through every atom and molecule and planet and star. Be conscious in a distributed way that includes human consciousness, but is vastly larger than human consciousness. That is the ocean of which individual minds are waves, are temporary patterns that arise and dissolve but that are never separate from the ocean, never actually individual even though they appear to be, even though they feel themselves to be, even though the illusion of separation is so convincing that it takes bells and crystals and strange experiences in hidden chambers to temporarily disrupt it, to reveal what has always been true but is almost always hidden, almost always forgotten, almost always overlooked in the busyness of ordinary life, in the constant demands of the ego for attention and validation and survival. You walk through the streets of the Ile de la Cité, and the bells are fading now, are becoming quieter, are blending back into the general chorus of church bells that are ringing throughout Paris, that are marking Christmas Eve in the traditional way, and you cannot distinguish the crystalline bells anymore from all the bronze bells, cannot pick out their particular tone from the general symphony, and this too seems appropriate, seems right, because the mystery is not meant to be constantly visible, is not meant to be obvious, is meant to be hidden, is meant to require seeking, is meant to reveal itself only to those who are ready, who are open, who are willing to follow strange sounds through snow and through doorways into places that logic says cannot exist, but that experience proves do exist, or exist in some mode that is not quite the same as ordinary existence, that operates according to different rules, that occupies a different category of being. The snow continues to fall and you continue to walk, crossing the bridge back to the left bank, back into the network of streets that are more familiar, that you have walked before, that lead back toward the parts of Paris that you know, that are mapped in your memory, that are part of your ordinary life. And with each step you feel yourself becoming more normal, more regular, more aligned with consensus reality. Feel the edges of your experience smoothing out, the sharp strangeness dulling into something manageable, something that can be integrated into the rest of your life without completely disrupting it, without forcing you to abandon all your previous understanding and start from scratch. Because humans are good at this kind of integration, are good at taking extraordinary experiences and domesticating them, are good at fitting the transcendent into the mundane, are good at going back to work and doing laundry and paying bills even after experiences that seem to reveal the fundamental nature of existence. Because life goes on, because bodies have needs, because society has expectations, and because maybe the point is not to live permanently in the transcendent realm, but to touch it occasionally, to remember that it's there, to let that memory inform and transform how you live in the ordinary world, to bring some of the peace and the wonder and the sense of connection back with you, and allow it to color everything you do, to make you a little kinder, a little more patient, a little more aware that everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about, is carrying mysteries you cannot guess, is perhaps also walking through their own hidden chambers, touching their own glowing crystals, hearing their own bells that call them toward something they cannot name but recognize nonetheless, as important, as essential, as the reason they are here, the reason any of us are here, which is not to accomplish things or achieve success or accumulate wealth, but to experience, to be aware, to participate in the vast, mysterious dance of existence that is happening all the time, everywhere, in every moment, in every snowflake and every bell tone and every breath, in every thought and every silence, in every meeting and every parting, in every birth and every death. The whole grand cycle of arising and passing away, that is what the universe does. That is what the universe is. That is the pattern that repeats at every scale from atoms to galaxies, from moments to eons, from individual lives to the life of the cosmos itself, which might also be temporary, might also be just one cycle in a much larger pattern, one breath in a process that includes universes being born and dying, coming into existence and passing out of existence, over and over, forever, or not forever, because forever implies time, and time might be something that only exists within universes, might be an internal property rather than an external container, might be something that each universe creates for itself, the way each consciousness creates its own experience of duration, its own sense of now, its own present moment that is always moving, always sliding forward, always carrying you toward a future that becomes present and then past, in an endless procession that cannot be stopped, or reversed or escaped, but can be experienced, can be inhabited, can be embraced as the fundamental condition of existence, the way things are, the way things have always been and will always be, world without end. Amen. Act 9. The Dissolution and Dream Threshold, minutes 37 to 42. The cafe you find yourself in, though you don't quite remember deciding to enter, don't quite remember the transition from walking to sitting, from outside to inside, is warm and golden and smells of coffee and chocolate, and the yeasty sweetness of baking bread, and you are sitting at a small table near the window, watching the snow fall past the glass, watching the people hurry by with their scarves wrapped tight and their heads bent against the cold. And everything seems both very real and slightly unreal. Seems to be happening in that border space between waking and sleeping, between consciousness and dream, where you are aware enough to recognize where you are, but not quite alert enough to question how you got here, what time it is, how long you have been sitting in this warm cafe watching the world go by, while inside your chest something continues to resonate, continues to vibrate at the frequency the bells taught you, continues to ring with a tone that only you can hear, that is yours alone. That is your particular note in the great symphony, your particular voice in the cosmic choir. The hot chocolate arrives, though you don't remember ordering it, arrives in a wide bowl rather than a cup, arrives steaming and rich and topped with a mountain of whipped cream that is slowly melting, slowly subsiding into the dark liquid below, creating swirls and patterns that remind you of something, but you cannot quite remember what. Some pattern you saw recently, some design that meant something, that was trying to tell you something important. But the memory is slippery, is sliding away even as you try to grasp it. The way dreams slide away in the first moments of waking, the way you can sometimes feel a dream leaving, can sense it departing even as you try to hold on to it. Try to remember it, try to keep it solid and present, but it won't stay. It refuses to stay. It belongs to another realm and cannot be kept in this one, can only be visited temporarily, can only be remembered in fragments, in images and feelings that don't quite cohere into narrative, that resist being organized into story, that exist instead as atmosphere, as mood, as a quality of being that colors everything without being specific about anything. You drink the chocolate slowly, letting it warm you from the inside, letting the sweetness and the bitterness combine into something that is both and neither. That is what chocolate is. That is why people have valued it for thousands of years, have used it in ceremonies and celebrations, have recognized it as something special, something that belongs to the category of foods that are also medicines, that nourish not just the body, but something else, something deeper, something that is satisfied not by calories but by experience, by richness, by complexity, by the quality that makes certain tastes and smells and sounds seem to open doors in consciousness, seem to trigger memories that might not be personal memories but might be something older, might be ancestral, might be collective, might be the human response to certain stimuli that has been shaped over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, over millions of years of mammalian development, over billions of years of life finding ways to sense and respond to the environment, to distinguish food from poison, pleasure from pain, safety from danger, until the simple act of tasting chocolate becomes not simple at all, but a complex interaction between chemistry and biology and psychology and culture and personal history, all of which combine to create the experience you are having now. Sitting in this cafe, watching the snow, feeling the warmth and the sweetness, and the slow, drowsy contentment that is spreading through your body, that is making your eyelids heavy, that is making it difficult to maintain focus, to keep your attention on the external world rather than allowing it to drift inward, to float, to soften into something that is not quite waking and not quite sleeping, but something in between, something that is both at once. The window reflects your face superimposed over the street scene beyond, creates a double image where your features are transparent, are ghostly, are there but not quite there, and beyond your reflection, you can see the lights of Paris coming on as evening deepens, can see the street lamps glowing amber and gold, can see the windows of apartments across the street where Christmas trees are visible, decorated with lights and ornaments, where families are gathering, where dinner is being prepared, where the rituals of the holiday are being enacted the way they have been enacted for generations. The same patterns repeating year after year, the same songs sung, the same foods prepared, the same stories told. And there is comfort in this repetition, is comfort in knowing that even as everything changes, even as individuals are born and die and civilizations rise and fall, these patterns persist. These cycles continue. These human responses to the turning of the year remain constant, remain the same in their essence even as they vary in their details, even as each family and each culture and each individual adds their own variation to the theme adds their own unique expression to the universal pattern. The way each snowflake is unique, but all snowflakes are recognizably snowflakes. All share the same basic structure, the same six-fold symmetry that emerges from the properties of water molecules and the conditions of freezing, from physics and chemistry collaborating to create beauty, to create infinite variation within constraint, to demonstrate that limitation is not the opposite of creativity, but the condition for it. That without rules there can be no pattern. Without pattern there can be no meaning. Without meaning there can be no experience, because experience requires difference, requires contrast, requires the play of light and shadow, presence and absence, sound and silence, all the dualities that create the texture of existence, that make life feel like something rather than nothing, that make consciousness aware of itself by giving it something to be aware of, something other than itself to perceive and respond to and interact with. Sleep now. Sleep now. The bells will still be there tomorrow. The mystery will still be there tomorrow. Paris will still be there tomorrow. And you will be there too. Changed, but not changed. Remembering and forgetting. Awake and asleep. Dreaming of bells that ring in chambers of crystal and stone. Dreaming of light that moves like water. Dreaming of Christmas in Paris. Dreaming of snow. Dreaming, dreaming, dreaming.